Hi, I'm Jim Pinkerton.
And I'm Steve Teles from Johns Hopkins.
And we're here for a special edition of Blogging Heads TV where we discuss Steve, who's a professor at Johns Hopkins University, new book called The Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement.
Right.
Published by Princeton University Press earlier this year.
Yes.
So, Steve, if I can just begin here, let's just get right to it. What did Pat Buchanan say to Richard Nixon in a memo that archivists have found since about the state of the conservative movement after the '68 election?
Well, again, this is right after Nixon's won, and so he's won this enormous victory over George McGovern, and Pat Buchanan writes in this memo sort of whining about how liberals control everything, but then he says, the Supreme Court is another story. The president has all but recaptured the institution from the left. His 4 appointments have halted much of its social experimentation, and the next 4 years should see the second branch of government become an ally and defender of the values and principles in which the president and his constituency believe. Obviously, this was not one of Pat Buchanan's greatest predictions. And so, in some sense, the story of the book is explaining how conservatives eventually did try to transform the courts, but not in the way that Buchanan thought they would.
And of course, the proof that they've transformed, that they've had a pretty significant impact since 1968 and 69, has been the success with which new judges, like John Roberts and Samuel Alito, plus of course Clarence Thomas and Scalia, have come along and really have had a pretty significant impact on the court in the last and the way Americans think about the role of law in society in the last 20 years. It's been quite a success story from a conservative point of view, just as the period, say, from the 50s through the 70s or maybe even to the 80s was a great success story for liberals. In terms of how they did. So talk a little bit about how you came to this idea of a book and how, because you really do chronicle the way we went from Pat Buchanan being unhappy in 1969 to Pat Buchanan saying in 2004 that the only reason he was supporting George Bush's re-election in that presidential election year was because of the courts.
Right.
He disliked Bush and everything else, but did agree with him on the courts and thought that was so important that he had to vote for Bush, even though he didn't like him.
Right, let me go back just a little bit to explain how I decided to write this book. I actually studied with conservatives when I was in graduate school, which is a fairly unusual experience in modern graduate education. All three.
Who are those?
Those were Martha Durthick, who is a very famous political scientist. She wrote a famous book called Policymaking for Social Security. I actually wasn't so aware that she was a conservative until I talked to her a couple years later, and she revealed that her girlhood hero was Robert Taft. Not the normal experience, again, of most political scientists. Jim Caesar and Steve Rhodes, who both were, for lack of a better word, Straussians. And this was sort of the background of the people I studied with. So conservatives, for me, were never some odd, exotic cast of characters who I had to try and figure out the way that you would a tribe on a South Pacific island. My first book was on U.S. welfare policy called Whose Welfare, and one of the chapters in that was on the conservative strategy of using waivers to produce substantial welfare reform, and that got me thinking about conservatives' long-term strategies for enacting change, and changes that weren't just dependent upon winning elections. So when I was looking around for another topic, I first started a book on Social Security, and I worked on that for a long time. And Social Security is the sort of topic that either fascinates you or sends you into a fit of boredom, and I gradually got into the latter category. But that didn't turn out to be a complete waste of time. One of the things I did in that is I did a number of interviews with Stuart Butler, who is now the vice president at the Heritage Foundation, and I was really deeply influenced by talking to Butler and thinking about how conservatives created these very long-term strategies for enacting change across a very wide range of issues, and so eventually I ended up thinking about trying to find a particular area that was a very interesting case of both the problem of entrenchment, the degree to which liberals had put their accomplishments beyond the control of elections, and the way the conservatives then had to mobilize against them. And the other reason I got in this is I got very unusual access to the internal papers of the conservative movement. The book is based on the internal papers of the Olin Foundation, the file cabinet from the Federalist Society, the internal papers of the Law and Economics Center, which ran these judicial programs on law and economics, and the public interest law firms like the Center for Individual Rights and the Institute for Justice. So to some degree, this book is probably deeper into the actual internals of the conservative movement than almost anything that's out there right now.
I agree. You have a lot of really good stuff in there, including one of the figures who's sort of a relatively unsung hero of the conservative legal revolution, which is Michael Horowitz, who I first came to know in the Reagan White House in 1981 when he was the general counsel at OMB, and I was just a nobody. I was just a kid, and he was extremely generous with his time, extremely helpful, extremely mentoring, and I now realize he was doing that, and to his great credit, to hundreds, if not thousands, of others during the course of his 30 years here in Washington.
Yeah, Horowitz, it plays a very important role in my book, and I'm actually writing a paper now on the Reagan Department of Justice and the sort of role of the of conservatives actually in government in the Reagan administration of encouraging the development of the conservative legal movement. And so in 1980, Horowitz writes this report that then later on imaginably just gets called the Horowitz Report, which was requested by the Scaife Foundation. And Scaife had asked Horowitz to go out and look at all these conservative public interest law firms that had grown out of the original conservative public interest law firm, which was the Pacific Legal Foundation, and to ask them how they were all doing. Because for the most part, conservatives thought all these firms, Mountain States Legal Defense Fund, the Southeastern Legal Defense Fund, all these other ones were great. And Horowitz went out and wrote this report that was really scathing. Basically said the conservatives were wasting an enormous amount of money on these firms, that they weren't really competing effectively with liberals. They weren't bringing a lot of original litigation. They weren't changing the larger legal debate. In some sense, they were just a sinkhole for money from both foundations and individuals who really didn't know any better. And so this had an enormous impact on conservative funders and foundations. They cut back dramatically in their funding for conservative public interest law. But in the long term, it had an effect because it created an opening for a whole new generation of conservative organizations. The Federalist Society, which I talk a lot about in the book, and a whole new generation of conservative public interest law firms who were able to say, all this other stuff we're doing isn't really working, but we actually have learned the lessons from the Horowitz Report, and we can do better. And so part of the story of the book is a story about learning. Too much, I think, of the story of conservative movement has been organized around what I call the myth of diabolical competence, the idea that conservatives are brilliant geniuses, if malevolent. Usually they're malevolent in most people's story. And
most academic story.
Most academic story, yes. Most academic story. And my book really tries to question this myth of diabolical competence, that conservatives are brilliant and they put together these comprehensive strategies in a room in the Mayflower Hotel somewhere, and then acted them all out. This is kind of an Oliver Stone sort of story, the kind that you get from most people who write on this. And the more I dug into this, the more I realized the conservatives in many of these areas really didn't know what was going to work. They put a lot of money into some things that didn't succeed. They made a lot of mistakes, and they learned from a lot of their mistakes. And I think this is actually a lesson that current liberals who are organizing could actually learn a lot from, that how much trial and error actually matters in organizational development.
Which is to say, markets work.
Yeah.
Trial and error.
Yes.
And the whole essence of sort of Austrian economics is you never know in advance what's going to happen, so don't try and predict it. Just try and sort of go with it. But I think one of the reasons that did give conservatives some confidence, and this is kind of a key point in your book, that what they're undertaking might work, is because, to put it bluntly, it had worked before, only on the other side. And I think that what your book sort of connected a lot of dots in my mind, including a book that I'd read 30 years ago by the same Pat Buchanan called Conservative Votes, Liberal Victories, in which it was written about 1975, in which he kind of just outlined how it was that Richard Nixon could win 2 presidential elections, and liberalism could be sort of repudiated as decisively as it was, sort of in the thinking of many, if not most, Americans, and yet liberals still sailed along, on issues that were hot at the time, like school busing, like affirmative action, of course, abortion, and they were pretty much impervious to political pressures. And so, I thought your book really just said, look, at a level above politics, it's not necessarily supposed to be this way, but this is the way it's worked out. Sort of a Milivan Gillis, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, type new class of lawyers and litigators and experts and foundation types and so on, including, it must be said, the New America Foundation, which is of this class, and for that matter, most of the universities have created a system that sort of speaks to itself and communicates with itself and has its own internal debates, but is pretty much oblivious to popular political pressures. And this is the way you expressed this, I thought was very effective. And not only did it serve the left well to win their policy debates, although at the cost of their own popularity in many cases, but the right has adopted that model too to a substantial degree. Right.
One of the themes in the book is that something pretty important changed in the character of American politics, or in what political scientists call the structure of the state, in the 1960s. A lot of people put an emphasis on how the actual policies changed in the 1960s, but in the process of changing those policies, liberals also changed a lot of how politics actually worked. They created a new political system, which by the 1970s people were actually writing books called The New American Political System, that created a lot more importance for the role of ideas and intellectuals, created these new regulatory agencies which were relatively insulated from popular control, were much more sensitive to policy networks, issue networks, and that all these things meant that simply winning elections was no longer sufficient for creating policy change, especially in areas that were especially characterized by this degree of insulation. You can think about the environment as a good area of this. Education is a good area of a highly insulated policy area. The way I talk about this in the book is to think about what kind of areas do you actually have a lever you can pull if you win an election, right? If you win an election, you can actually go in and change tax rates, right? That's fairly easy to do, and Reagan did it in 1981. But what if you think that the way that teachers are teaching in schools all over the country in thousands of different school districts are using a pedagogy that you think is inappropriate, right? What's the lever you pull when you win an election? The point is there is no lever, right? Conservatives could go around looking for that lever all they want, and the same thing is obviously true in areas that are highly susceptible to control by courts. And the point, therefore, is that conservatives needed to find a way to compete issue by issue in these very specialized, insulated policy areas of which the courts are probably the best example. And so in that sense, I think Buchanan was right. That is, something changed in the way that politics worked. And the argument of the book is it took a very long time for conservatives to actually figure out how to get over this problem of conservative electoral victories and liberal policy victories. That it wasn't the case that there was an obvious way that you would actually mobilize, and that's why a lot of the story of the book is a story about mistakes and learning rather than a story about brilliant geniuses who immediately hatched a project and then simply saw it all play out.
Exactly. I mean, I think that when you said the structure of American politics, it made me think of the British historian Louis Namir, who was active sort of in the first half of the last century, wrote a book. I won't get the title exactly right. It was like The Structure of English Politics at the Accession of George III, which would be 1760. And what Namir did is he, obviously writing 150 years later, got into the filing cabinets, as it were, of the British House of Commons, all 500, if I remember correctly, 558 members, and sort of went through. Now, here's who they were, here's what they did, here's what they thought, here's what clubs they were a member of, here's whose payroll in terms of some duke or king or something they were beholden to.
Patronage.
Patronage, exactly. I mean, he had it all worked out in considerable detail with a great feel for how somebody's sort of interests and political or personal would affect their voting patterns. And my takeaway from the book was just to think, okay, look, this is a usual gang of hacks and morons and idiots and stuff, and a few statesmen floating around England in 1760, but. Since the Prime Minister was Pitt the Elder, Britain won one of the most spectacular victories it ever did in the 7 Years' War. These clowns were there for that, and then of course, pretty much with a certain amount of mortality aside, they're pretty much still in place. 15 years later, when Britain had a disaster with the American Revolution. So the same gang of people can either be really smart or really dumb. Depending on the quality of the leadership they get, and whether they can find some brilliant person who can sort of whip up the gang of hacks and turn them into an effective, competent operation. I mean, the business community, and I've heard Mike Horowitz say this to me many, many times, is full of sort of smug, complacent, double-chinned, unless they work out a lot, in which case they're not double-chinned, who basically play golf and don't really have any ideas. And they were just made mincemeat of by some left-wing Naderite who stayed up late and got to work early, working in some underfunded, at least in those terms back then, underfunded, although oftentimes they've morphed into rich trial lawyers now, who had ideas. And that was Mike's point over and over again. You can never spend enough money to defeat a good idea, especially a good idea which is so wired into the system. Or bad ideas, which is so wired in the system by rules and procedures that you never even knew about. One of the examples you cite in the book is the bilingual. I never even heard of this before. The Bilingual Education Act of 1967, which nobody really realized what they're getting into. But you spoke of bad pedagogy. Well, okay, I think certainly every conservative thinks, and frankly a lot of liberals think too, that bilingual education is a bad idea. But yet it got voted on. It became the law. And then by the time the issue heated up, 10 or 15 years later, conservatives were outraged and English sort of only people were outraged. But they look at, oh gosh, it's a statute. The New York City School Board or the LA School Board or whoever could say, look, we're just, wink, wink, we're just following the law. And it took another couple decades until a fellow named Ron Unz came along and started passing referendum through popular vote, which really was a blunt instrument to do it. It took 30 years to peel back what was voted on almost absentmindedly back in the 60s.
Right, a couple things on that. I mean, one is there's a big theme in the book about the role of business in modern conservatism, which I think a lot of, again, things more by people to my left have written on this kind of imagines conservatism as a big business conspiracy. And the deeper I got into this, the more it became clear to me that, especially for actual conservatives, especially more libertarian conservatives of the kind that I'm looking at disproportionately in the book, business was a problem. Businessmen were not, again, I don't think you necessarily have to assume they're idiots or anything else, just that they have their own interests. And in many cases, businessmen had made deals, right? They had cut deals with the modern welfare state, the modern regulatory state. You can see this very much in the case of the environment. In lots of these areas, business opposed environmental regulation, but once they got put into place, they tried to figure out how to simply impose the cost of the modern welfare regulatory state on their competitors. And also because they were big, in many cases they were able to game the system to minimize the cost on themselves. So in that sense, they weren't a very good patron for actually doing a full-on attack on the modern regulatory welfare state. There's one great story that was told me by Chip Meller, who's the head of now the Institute for Justice. In the early 80s, he was at the Mountain States Legal Defense Fund, and he tells a story about how when he was at MSLF, they had tripped upon what they thought was this fantastic case, which was a case of the Denver cable monopoly, right? And one thing good libertarians should be against is government-created monopolies. Well, so they brought this case. They said, "Oh, we're going to sue them, right? We're going to stop them from creating this this government-created monopoly." Well, it turns out the guy who was being given the monopoly was Bill Daniels, who was a very popular conservative figure, and not only that, was close friends with the people who were in charge of the Mountain States Legal Defense Fund, including Joe Coors. So Joe Coors finds out about this. He quits the head of being the head of MSLF, which he more or less helped to create, saying, and I'm paraphrasing, I created MSLF to attack the Naderites, not to do this sort of crap. And you can see, I think, stories about that across the board where business turned out just not to be a very good patron, one, because they had mixed interests, and two, because they didn't have sort of sector-specific expertise, right? Just because they were good at business didn't mean that they knew anything about how to run a legal organization. And the other thing I was going to say is your point about bilingual education. I should note that my story from that comes from an absolutely stupendous book by John Scrutiny called The Minority Rights Revolution. That if you look at the case of UNS, in the book I argue that the really scarcest resource in politics is not money, it's not it's not having foot soldiers, it's leadership, right? There's actually very few people out there who turn out to be good at running organizations, who turn out to be good at being intellectual or policy entrepreneurs. And so you can waste an enormous amount of money in politics. And the people who point to the conservatives and say, oh, this was just because they had so much money, so much resources. In lots of these cases, the Ford Foundation had, millions more dollars than the Bradley Foundation or Olin or any of these guys ever spent. But it turns out the guys at Olin and Bradley, by the time they learned a lot of lessons, turned out to be very good at spending money and identifying policy entrepreneurs or intellectual entrepreneurs who were able to take advantage of the opportunities that were available to them.
Right, I agree. On the issue of business and differential cost and how they can use regulation as a hammer against competition, the most obvious one is tariffs. I mean, a tariff is a pretty good way to make money and at the expense of consumers and so on. It may be a good idea, it may be a bad idea, but it's undeniable that it violates free trade orthodoxy, as most libertarians and free market conservatives would think, but obviously, at any given moment, presidents, including Ronald Reagan, including George W. Bush, have imposed tariffs on some sector of the steel industry, the motorcycle industry, and so on, just because they felt they had to, and just put business and the Chamber of Commerce and so on at cross purposes with intellectuals who are very oftentimes blunt in using phrases like corporate pukes. I hear that all the time as just describing the Cape Street lobbyists who are theoretically their allies. Although, of course, if you look at the FEC reports and so on, I mean, they've always been big givers to both sides on almost all issues over the last 30 or 40 years, oftentimes frankly favoring the Democrats. And of course, when you come down just plain old rich people, I don't think the left has quite come to grips with what do you do when of the 24 richest communities in America, 24 richest counties, John Kerry won 16 of them. And I suspect the skew will even be more pronounced in 2008 with Obama versus McCain. But on the subject of regulation, there was a study from the Small Business Administration a few years ago. Is actually quoted in the book by Levy and the other guy from Cato, whose name escapes me right now. The Dirty Dozen. It's a
Chip Miller.
Of Miller and Levy. They cite a study from the SBA that said that environmental regulation costs the average large company about $700 an employee.
Right.
Because they can amortize it over a large number of employees. Whereas it costs the average small business with less than 20 employees an average of $3,200 per employee. So,
right.
In many cases, the libertarians and the free marketeers have come into alliance with people like, Gabriel Kolko, who's a leftist, at least he used to be, who wrote a book called The Triumph of Conservatism, back in describing a period of creating the Interstate Commerce Commission and the FTC and so on. I said, look, these were, government cartels in effect that the business community at the time was perfectly happy to support the creation of. and has been, for the most part, perfectly happy to see continued in new forms, including the old Civilian Aeronautics Board, the CAB, which fixed airline pricing until it was abolished, I guess, by 1980.
Right.
So yeah, there's never been a good alliance between big business and these free market groups, who oftentimes saw themselves very much in opposition to both big business and big government.
Right.
And they were.
Right. And the other thing I think that Horowitz really pointed out in that report was that business was problematic for a second reason, right? The first is what you talk about, that in terms of their having a kind of conflict of interest between conservative ideology and their own business interests. But the other thing is that Horowitz said is that, look, there's all these opportunities for conservatives out there on things that business simply doesn't give a damn about. That is, there are areas where, for example, conservatives could support the interest of inner city entrepreneurs or black individuals who cared about the quality of their schools, or academics who were being messed with by their university administration. All these areas were things where there were really interesting opportunities for conservatives to bring cases, but they were simply not of any interest for business supporters. And so again, you had all this whole network of business led public interest law firms who either had their interest, either had a conflict of interest, or simply had no interest. And so what Horowitz really said is that essentially the conservatives needed to develop their own new class. They needed to develop a class that wasn't dependent upon the kind of material base of conservatism, which was both business and kind of grassroots conservatism. And they needed to have in some sense, a degree of autonomy. They needed to be the ones really in charge, and they needed to go out and find people who would support what they wanted to do, as opposed to starting with people who had money and do what they were interested in doing.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Federalist Society in particular.
Okay.
As an example of exactly this.
So, again, the Federalist Society starts in 1983, and again, I think this is a case where some of the story that's told about them isn't exactly right. It's often told as a story about these sort of elite, very senior conservatives who start this organization because people pay attention to people like Scalia and Bork, but they weren't really ones who started the organization. The people who started the organization were a bunch of conservative and libertarian law students, people like Lee Lieberman Otis, who's now still working for the Federalist Society. She worked for Spence Ackerman in the Department of Energy.
She worked with me in the Bush 41 White House.
Yeah, she worked in the White House doing judicial selection. People like David McIntosh, who also worked in the Bush White House in the Council of Competitiveness, and then got elected to Congress from Indiana. Steve Calabrese, who's a congressman, who's a professor at Northwestern University. These people all started the Federalist Society really in the early 1980s, and they really just started a series of chapters in their own law schools, because in many cases they felt like they were the only ones there. Chicago wasn't so much the case, but certainly at Harvard and at Yale, it was very easy to feel like the only conservative in their law school. So they created these various different student chapters, and then they created what was initially supposed to be this small meeting at Yale Law School, and all of a sudden there was all this demand. All these people started writing them and calling them and saying, how do we start a Federalist Society chapter? And then they thought, well, we probably ought to think about that. We probably ought to actually create something called the Federalist Society so we have an answer to these people when they ask, how do you create a Federalist Society chapter? So in that sense, I think the Federalist Society really came about because there was a untapped desire for organization. And it happened to be that these people, Calabrese and Otis and McIntosh and the others, were there to take advantage of it. Now, in my book, I argue it turns out to be very important that these specific people were there to take advantage of the opportunity. Somebody who had different orientation might have created a very different organization. And in particular, I think the argument I have is that one of the things the Federalist Society was very good at is not getting involved in a lot of the things that people think they're involved in. The organization always was very good at what I call boundary maintenance, always thinking about what was the thing that they really needed to do, and what were things that hopefully the organization would help other people do, but they wouldn't have to do themselves. So, for example, the Federalist Society was presented after they had gotten a bunch of their chapters going by the late 1980s with the opportunity to create a litigating division, basically to go out and bring cases, because a lot of these conservatives thought that their existing firms weren't any good, as we talked about before, and the organization looked at this and they said, look, if we are going to create a litigating division, we're going to have to take positions, right? You can't bring a case without taking a position. Well, if we take a position, we've got an organization that is conservatives and libertarians, social conservatives, and eventually we're going to end up alienating part of our base. And so what the Federalist Society was always good at doing was trying to make itself a sort of safe space for a broad range of conservatives and libertarians, and to create an opportunity for them to network, to get contacts, to get deeper sets of ideas that they could then use on their own to do other kinds of activities.
Right, there's this kind of a parallel there between the Federalist Society, as you describe it, as sort of a clearinghouse, and what Grover Norquist has done. There's a great, with his so-called Wednesday meeting, which is a gather, as it suggests, a weekly meeting of conservative activists here in Washington, and the Wednesday meeting doesn't have dues. I realize the Federalist Society does have dues, but it is very loose, and it is mostly oriented toward, if you're a member of the center-right coalition, as Grover defines it, which is basically sort of libertarian, anti-government, what he calls the Leave Us Alone coalition, and he's written a book with that exact title. You come and sort of present, and he's pretty explicit about this sort of cheerful news. You're not there to say, I hate the guy sitting next to me.
Right.
You're there to say, we're working together on this, and it doesn't necessarily, by any stretch, encompass the whole of what conservatives from the NRA to the Right to Life to Right to Work might be thinking about, but it's what they bring to that table. And so the Federalist Society just becomes a place where you go and meet people and discuss things and get ideas, and then go do your own thing, with the additional stipulation, of course, and this is because the nature of law means that there's all these sort of roadblocks to your career that you can either jump or not jump, depending on who likes you and who doesn't. And the most obvious one, who gets picked as a clerk. And you've got a great factoid in the book about how all the 3/4 of all the Supreme Court justice clerks come from just 7 different law schools, which I assume is Harvard, Yale, Columbia,
Stanford.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it's the usual suspects, almost all of which have an overwhelmingly left-wing coloration, which makes, of course, the Federalist Society kind of a fun thing to be part of if you're feeling contrarian and rambunctious there. But anyway, to be picked as a clerk, to be appointed to some job at the Justice Department or the General Counsel of some agency somewhere, and, of course, to be picked as a judge or even a Supreme Court justice is, that becomes an exercise in sort of sociology and anthropology and networking and so on. So if you had ambitions to be any of those things, you were on the right conservative side, you were well advised to become a member of the Federalist Society and just have lunch with as many people as possible on your way up the chain.
Right, and that's why one thing I think it's important to recognize about the Federalist Society is that I think people, again, have this image that somehow orders are being sent out from their office, right? That Gene Meyer, who's the president of the Federalist Society, has a list in his office of all the people that the Federalist Society wants to appoint to the federal bench, and they, people call them and they tell them who should be on the Third Circuit. And I don't think that's how it works at all. I mean, the way I think it operates is that if you are a participant in the Federalist Society meetings, if you go to their activities, you develop a reputation. And again, in the early years, you would have developed a reputation as being somebody who was reasonably hardcore because there was a stigma attached with being a Federalist Society member. And that stigma, of course, was a very good signifier for people who were trying to find people who they could trust. If you wanted to put somebody in a special assistant position in the Justice Department, you wanted to put somebody as a district court judge, you wanted somebody who you really believed would actually go there and do what they were supposed to do. But in most cases, again, information about that kind of thing was very limited. And so one of the advantages the Federalist Society had is if you were going to their meetings, you were talking at their seminars, doing whatever, a number of people would have gotten very good information about the quality of person you were and whether or not you were a reliable conservative, whether you were squishy. And so, again, that role doesn't play out as a kind of hierarchical story where the Federalist Society, makes all the decisions. but it's a network story where being part of that network creates more information. It creates more people that somebody can call. If somebody wants to find someone who would be a good district court judge in the Northern District of Arkansas, right? 30 years ago, nobody would have had any idea. You would have been basically just sort of, being...
You would have called the Chamber of Commerce.
Right, you would have called the Chamber of Commerce, or you would have called the local bar association or something like that, and they probably wouldn't have had any idea either, or they would have just nominated somebody who was their friend. Right now...
They would nominate Harriet Myers.
Right, and again, Myers is an interesting story because that's almost a kind of throwback to the older pre-Federalist Society form of organization. And I sort of tell that story in the beginning of the book to show just how much changed, right? If you go back to the Nixon period, that was a period in which pretty much, conservatives, and if you look at John Dean has this great book, I just think it's a fantastic book on the Rehnquist choice. And one of the things that you learn from that is just the degree to which conservatives had absolutely no idea what they were doing. They had absolutely no idea who actually out there actually believed what they did. It shows pretty clearly how thin their bench was. That is, Nixon desperately wanted to pick a woman and couldn't find anybody. Literally could not find anybody who was at least had any evidence of being conservative and was a woman. Right. One thing that, of course, has changed over the last 30 years is that Republican presidents, conservative presidents now, are able to kind of optimize in more than one dimension. Right. That is, they could find someone who was both conservative and would be able to fit one or the other of their other political preferences. And again, I think that's one thing that the Federalist Society has affected really dramatically, and I think it's actually more important below the level of the Supreme Court. People always pay attention to that level, but when you get down to the district court level or the appeals court level or appointing someone to work in the Justice Department, that's where information is likely to be even more scarce, and where something like the Federalist Society, where if you could call somebody in the Little Rock chapter of the Federalist Society and say, do you know anybody who would be good for this, right? You're going to get pretty good information out of that, again, without there being any conspiracy or any sort of centrally determined hierarchy.
Exactly, and I mean the two names. I mean, Harriet Myers, of course, was Bush's counsel, and just seen as exact what they didn't want, sort of a not very smart, sort of vaguely conservative, but mostly just sort of a Bush lackey. And so she got run out of the job even before they could vote on her by the conservatives, by the Federalist Society types who said, no, not this. Because the two names that any Federalist Society type would talk about, which again return to the Supreme Court just in terms of the most well-known topics that prove very, very different points, are Robert Bork and David Souter. And I'll let you talk a second, but to make the point that Bork was a galvanic experience for every conservative, especially a conservative legal type, and David Souter was a bitter lesson about what not to do. But I'll let you take it.
Right. I mean, Bork is an interesting story. In the book, I really tell that as a story of, for the conservative movement, they experienced that as a story of martyrdom. That is, a very large number of the people who were involved in the Federalist Society had been students of Bork. Certainly that was the case with Calabrese. They were very close to him. They saw him as sort of the example of what they most believed in, right? The kind of person who they really thought ought to be a justice, right? A very important intellectual, one of the most important figures, both in law and economics, which is not usually known about Bork. He was a very early figure in antitrust and changing people's views about that, and in the development of originalism. And so the defeat of Bork, one, showed conservatives that just having someone with sterling credentials wasn't good enough. That wasn't going to let you win. But also, I think it showed that conservatives hadn't really worked out a lot of their ideas. Their ideas were still considered to be off the wall. That's a phrase I use frequently in the book. Bork's ideas, when he actually had to go out and explain them to people in a congressional committee hearing, were still considered to be fairly exotic. And so when he tried to explain them, they were very easy to caricature. And also when he tried to back off from them, then that made him look suspicious. And so the Souter pick is interesting because that was a case where the Bush administration wanted to pick someone who was not going to be a political problem for them, right? That was one of the things that they had sort of learned from Bork was...
I'll just clarify that. John Sununu thought that.
Right. Not everybody, right? But at least some of the people who were in the administration thought that. And the interesting thing is that the conservative movement hadn't really developed to the point where you would be able to find someone who both didn't have a track record, that is, where the information that outsiders had was limited, but who insiders knew really was their guy, right? And that, I think you could certainly say, was the case with Roberts, right? I mean, Roberts had something of a track record, but for the most part, insiders knew a lot more about him than outsiders could prove. And so I think you could see that even when people like Cass Sunstein were saying, we don't think Roberts is going to be that bad, he's going to be one case at a time, and it turns out he's as much a conservative as anybody else, right? The people who were making that choice knew exactly what they were getting. But the people on the outside had a much harder time proving it. And I think that's one of the things that having a really powerful network does, is it gives information to insiders that isn't really available to outsiders. And that's something...
Right. And so in the case of Souter, John Sununu, I was there for this in the Bush 41 White House, said, look, don't worry, Souter's okay. He doesn't have the paper trail. As I recall, he was on the New Hampshire Supreme Court, which is where Sununu knew him from.
And I think he had just been appointed to the First Circuit.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So in any case, Sununu said, trust me on this guy. I know him. He's fine. He'll be great. And he's turned out to be, Ruth Bader Ginsburg in terms of how he votes. So he's been a complete bitter disappointment to conservatives. Whereas Roberts, who didn't have much of a paper trail either, as you say, has turned out to be a great success. I mean,
right.
They're very happy with him. So I guess the lesson there is that the conservative activists, and not by any stretch just lawyers, but just conservatives out there, felt that the Bork nomination fight of '87 was a lesson. Look, we got to mobilize. We need to, develop all these tools of advocacy and agitation and, lobbying and so on that we haven't had. And the Souter case it comes up all the time, and especially in this, we've had all these 5-4 decisions lately, on everything from death penalty for child rapists to the Boumediene Guantanamo case, and several others, all 5-4 one way or the other. That have made everybody think, oh yeah, Souter, him.
Right.
How do we let that slip through? We won't make that mistake again. But one thing that's interesting is you mentioned Bork and how he was a professor for a long time at Yale, which is arguably the most sort of politically conscious left-wing law school in the country. And to its credit, it's a big enough place that allows a few conservatives in there, and gives them tenure and treats them well, although in the minority status, is that the degree to which, again, this mirroring phenomenon, I mean, that the conservatives had a reason to think that they could win this battle because they were sort of mirroring the institutions that Ralph Nader, another Yale Law School graduate, as is Mike Horowitz, by the way.
Right.
They all sort of came out of that. Some went right, some went left, and the lefties came first, but the righties sort of followed them. And I think that's an interesting point, because one of the dangers that the left fell into was that at the time that Richard Nixon was winning elections and Pat Buchanan was making fun of liberals as nattering nabobs of negativism and so on, and Spiro Agnew and all the rest of these Nixon types who were getting votes, they weren't getting anywhere in the political. The left was losing in politics after about 1968, and yet still winning at the court level. And so as the liberals just got used to winning in litigation and in advocacy, I think a lot of their political skills kind of attenuated. And it makes me wonder now, 30 years later, that the conservative revolution, counter-revolution, whatever you want to call it, has been pretty successful. But now, as we look at the 2006 election results and possibly the 2008 election results, certainly at the congressional level and maybe at the presidential level as well, where the Republicans look destined to be hit pretty hard, one wonders whether the conservatives, having mirrored brilliantly the successes of the liberals in decades past, have now run into the same problem where the grassroots start to look kind of weak.
Right. I mean, this is a complicated story. I mean, I think there's sort of two parts here, which is one, why did liberalism have its grassroots atrophy and its sort of elite build up? And then the question of why does that seem now to be kind of going in the other direction? So let me do those kind of in order. The first one, I think that it's the case that, in trying to explain political outcomes, I come from sort of the elite school of people like Mosca and Pareto, and I think that elites really are almost always the important movers in politics. But the question is, what do they have to do in order to get power? And this I take from a great book by my Johns Hopkins colleague called Diminished Democracy by Ben Ginsberg and Matt Crinson. And they say that it's always the case that political entrepreneurs or elites, they have something they want to do. But the question is, how are they going to do it? And usually, through most American politics, if you were a political entrepreneur and you wanted to do something, you had to go out and mobilize people. You had to go out and organize them. You had to go out and, and capture federated organizations, the kind that Theda Skocpol has talked about, right? And that was hard work. That took a lot of time. It took a lot of shoe leather to do that. What changed in the 1960s and 1970s was the availability of third-party funding, right? That is, now you could skip over that whole process of going out there in the country and mobilizing a lot of people and creating a mass organization, because you could go right to the Ford Foundation and get a big grant to start an organization. And if you look at the Environmental Defense Fund, the National Natural Resources Defense Council, MALDEF, all these organizations that we associate with the sort of explosion of liberal advocacy in the late 1960s and 1970s, almost all of these came about largely purely out of third-party Ford Foundation funding, or in some cases they got funding from government. And so, if you're a political entrepreneur, you're going to take that option because that had a lot lower transaction costs. And so for a long time, I think that was one of the things that explains the change in the character of liberalism was the incentives for organization altered, right? The other thing that happens, again, I think on the conservative side, is conservatives start trying to mobilize in the 1970s because they're losing. And in general, the incentive to organize comes out of failure, right? When you're really losing, that's when you start changing your strategy. So conservatives started to really lose in the 1970s at the elite level, and that's the point at which they start trying to create this whole network of organizations, but don't really figure out how to do it until the 80s and 90s. Liberals, I think, didn't really, I think their electoral failure hadn't really sunk in until the late 1990s, and really starting in 1994, but really not so much until 2000, had the complete abject failure of liberalism as an electoral project sunk in, and that was the point at which they start rethinking their organizational strategy, thinking about then how to build back up their grassroots, how to change the party organization, how to change
with groups such as Move On, for example,
right.
Move On, which began in almost 10 years ago today.
Exactly. Move On is a perfect example, I think, of a case of learning, where liberals realized that the older strategy that, for example, the Clinton administration had done in terms of how it supported its party, simply getting a lot of rich people to contribute to the Democratic National Committee and to campaigns, that this strategy of a very elite stratum party had really reached its limits. And so Move On and the other kind of organizations that come out of the Netroots are a kind of adaptation to the need for real party building. And for the most part, Democrats didn't need to do party building. They didn't need to really create a strong institutional party in the way that Republicans had for, going all the way back to Eisenhower. And this you can see in a great book that's going to come out soon by a guy named Dan Galvin, that Republicans really were party builders. Even Nixon, who most people think of as a kind of predator, was a party builder, but Democrats, for the most part, exploited their party. Democratic presidents used their party to achieve their own ends, and it was only when Democrats really were in the crapper by the end of the 90s that they start thinking about how to rebuild their party and rebuild their grassroots. And so I think
what did your friend say about Nixon? I missed that.
Well, Nixon, again, the usual story about Nixon is that he was an example of how modern presidents are predators on their own party. That is, they use the party for their own narrow, short-term interests. And there's a whole school of thought, going back to people like Sid Milkis, who's written books on this, that explains this as a feature of all modern presidents, going back to Eisenhower. And the thing that Galvin shows in his book is that, in fact, all the Republican presidents, Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, Bush, all of them were party builders. And the reason they were party builders is that, for the most part, the Republicans were the minority party. And because they were the minority party, they had a very strong incentive to build up their party organization, whereas the Democrats, for the most part, through this period, thought of themselves as the majority period. And so Democratic presidents, for the most part, thought about how they could use the party apparatus to achieve their policy goals rather than invest in the party apparatus to achieve goals later on.
I must say that I'm interested in Mr. Galvin's argument, because certainly the history of like the 1972 Nixon re-election campaign, where Nixon won 49 states out of 50 against McGovern and got one of the highest percentages ever, and yet the Republicans lost a net of 2 Senate seats. And the same thing true in 1984. Reagan won 49 states, and yet again the Republicans ended up net -2 in the Senate. That just wasn't supposed to happen that way. And Eisenhower is popularly thought of as having much preferred to work with Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn on the Democratic side back in the 50s than with the likes of William Noland and Robert Taft and so on. He's got a very contrarian argument to people's understanding of what happened back then, which of course is what academics or book writers ought to be doing. They ought to be challenging things,
right? Well, I mean,
and then put themselves up against all the possible reputations that might come crashing down on them.
Right. I mean, the thing, and I'll just talk about it for a minute, about that's interesting about Galvin's argument is he actually went really deep into the archives on this. And again, I think that's the kind of work that I have the most respect for, and but that's always, people always say about whatever it is that they actually do. But he actually went into the archives looking at Eisenhower and Nixon and Reagan. And one of the things that's interesting about Eisenhower is that he deeply invested in the Republican Party apparatus in terms of recruiting candidates and building back up the Republican National Committee. Now, for that, one of the reasons he's doing that is he's trying to build modern republicanism, modern being not what Robert Taft was doing. And he thought, I need to recruit a whole new generation of people to do that. I need a whole new kind of people, including in the South. That is the Southern strategy that people often talk about. Really started with Eisenhower, not later on, and because he was actually trying to find sort of moderate entrepreneurial people in the South to be the backbone of the new Republican Party. And in the case of Nixon, and Nixon consciously, decides before the 1972 election that, I've done all this party building stuff. I'm trying to build a new Republican majority. I've been investing in the party organization. But, for this election, I kind of need to back off and create my own organization. But as soon as the election's over, he's back doing party organization again. He's back trying to, find new opportunities for the party to create new organizations. And I think the same thing is true with Reagan in 1984. That is, that those periods right around the election were the exception, rather than with the Democrat, they were the rule.
That is an interesting argument. But again, you learn stuff by actually going to look it up and reading memos and so on. Right. So the one question I have, and we're about to wrap up here, we got a little bit more time, is to the extent that conservatives have successfully mirrored or modeled what liberals have done. And to the extent that politics become sort of an exercise in elites, where if you can sort of, I don't want to sound too, Chomsky-y here, but
go for it.
The extent that one can, there's been a lot of literature on this back and forth about sort of the declining significance of elections and so on. And I was just at a lecture by David Simon, who's not a political scientist. He is the television producer who did Homicide right up there in Baltimore, and The Wire, and has a new miniseries coming out called Generation Kill, which is based on the sort of war memoir of the embedded Rolling Stone magazine journalist Evan Wright, which will be on HBO shortly, and Simon, in a session convened by the Campus Progress, which is sort of the liberal youth subset of the Center for American Progress, they were talking about the election and the Iraq War and how it all played out and stuff, and the moderator sort of holding up the liberal flag said, "Oh, of course, if Obama wins, well, things will get better. And Simon said, look, don't kid yourself. The structures of the war and the foreign policy and the assumptions that have been made cross party lines. The elite in this town and across the country on foreign affairs is deeply committed to a bunch of stuff, including. And I'm saying more than Simon said. I'm just trying to explicate his point. But his point was, do not kid yourself, folks. This Iraq war will not end if Obama wins. And of course, that was almost exactly the same time that Obama was revising, shall we say, and then unrevising. So who knows, his position on when we should withdraw and so on. So there's plenty of murk there. But I think that the point that Simon was getting at, and he's a Hollywood guy, not a political scientist, although he certainly seems extremely committed to issues and of sort of his own idea of sort of public service in terms of making this miniseries and doing other things about sort of gritty and even terrible elements of American society that need changing, was saying, look, when the elites get their heads together on something, it's very hard to undo them, to deracinate them, even with elections. Which is one has that feeling that if Obama gets in there and it's Richard Holbrooke and whoever else left over from the Clinton administration or even the Carter administration comes in to run things, then things might not change that much. And maybe they shouldn't, but maybe the voters think they should, and maybe the voters will be fed an unpleasant supper. After the election, if things don't change. But let's talk, looking ahead here a little bit about sort of where this whole idea you have about the elites sort of carrying on a conversation, because this is not just law.
Right.
There's a similar sort of arcane secret language of foreign policy and national security and homeland security. I mean, it's again in the same vein. Probably most net rootsers think that, and then again, that's not the entire Democratic Party. But it's the noisiest part of it. Probably are appalled that Obama has, I guess not to put too fine a point on it, flip-flopped on this issue of FISA, the Federal, whatever it stands for, Intelligence Surveillance Act or whatever, and the FISA courts. So to what extent are we on to something that does the conservative legal revolution represent merely one facet of a larger phenomenon of experts and technocrats sort of displacing small d democracy?
Right. Well, I mean, I think we have to distinguish between two kind of elite stories you might tell. Simon's is a kind of elite conspiracy story, right? Where we have this impression that there's all this competition and there's two teams, but in fact, they're all really on the same team. That's one story. And I think there are areas where that's not totally crazy. I think that the case of immigration isn't a bad story of that, right? Where the intellectual elites of both parties are pretty open to open immigration and are hostile to restrictionism. And so even though there's a lot of sympathy for restrictionism out in the United States, there's simply no elite carrier to push it, right? There's nobody who's able to really be an organizer on it, except in the case of referenda, which sometimes pass. But in terms of the actual legislative stuff, in terms of changing ideas, there's no elite supporter of it. In the case of Iraq, I think that's a little different story of entrenchment, right? So the first story is a story of entrenchment because you have elite consensus and there's nobody to act on popular demand. The second story is a story, I think, more or less of the problem of transition costs, right? That I think, I don't think there's any question that Obama, at this point, still thinks the Iraq War was a bad idea. It isn't the case that there's this elite conspiracy that says that this was always a good idea, and, I said a bunch of things to get elected, but now I know what the right position is. I think it's simply the case that Obama is looking at this and saying, Jesus, I'm going to be right in the middle of something I didn't start, but I got to get out of it, right? And getting out of it isn't as simple as saying we shouldn't have gotten into it. And I think that's really the problematic that Obama faces, and I think you see it in a lot of other policy areas.
I think there's a difference. Just to stop right there. I think that there's and I wrote about this a couple years ago for the American Conservative magazine, in which I said, look, it's not. Let's talk about Chuck Hagel. Chuck Hagel doesn't like the Iraq War. Okay, fine. But does Chuck Hagel think that America has a, quote, leadership role to play in the Middle East? And the answer is he does, because it's hard to think of any politician who doesn't think that. Now, you can say that's democracy at work in terms of this, but it's not as if the average American is waking up thinking about the Strait of Hormuz and the Khyber Pass and the Gaza Strip and so on and so on. But the policy elites in this town are. And so Obama the transition costs of Iraq and getting out may slow Obama down, and maybe for all we know the Maliki government will throw us out. So who knows? But I think the larger issue is, and it's just, again, it's more to be noted than to be resolved, is the whole structure of sort of the presumption of U.S. leadership on behalf of democracy, on behalf of American interests, on behalf of maintenance, who knows, counterterrorism, whatever, so broad. I mean, and not just the Middle East. I mean, if you look at the map of the combat commands that the Pentagon has, there's one for South America, and there's one for Europe, and there's one for Africa now, and there's one for the Middle East, and there's one for Asia. It's almost as if we, have already sort of decided what sectors of the world, there's a presumption that America would send troops or aid or both to any place in the world if something goes wrong.
Right.
And that's an incredibly expensive presumption that I think there's very few people in the elites in America, other than at the Cato Institute or places like that, or the Institute for Policy Studies, who would challenge that. And yet, I really don't think that very many Americans, really think this is a good idea on a day-to-day basis. Right,
and I should say that my friend Chris Preble, who's at the Cato Institute, is in fact writing a book right now, basically doing what you are arguing at least somebody ought to be doing, which is questioning this whole thing, root and branch. But just to sort of bring it back to the theory of the book for a second, I think one thing that this suggests is there's two kind of elite stories, and I think they're both capable of being right? I mean, one is that there's a cross-elite consensus, right? And I think on foreign policy, even though there's conflict over whether we should get in Iraq or whatever, there's an underlying sort of liberal internationalist position that isn't obvious. I'm more sympathetic to it than I think you are, but that really is the consensus, and there are a few dissenters to it, but there aren't that many, and issues like that, regardless of the fact that there's a large popular consensus for something, or at least there would be a large popular base for something, that's not likely to get heard, at least in a very serious way, in politics. People who have that other position are going to be considered to be off the wall. They're going to be treated as sort of nutty and not worth arguing with, right? And that's an enormous part of politics. If you can make the other side seem crazy, right, then you pretty much won the battle, regardless of whether or not there's a lot of popular support for something. So there's that kind of story, and then there's an elite story about competing elites, which is really the story of my book, which is a story about where we now have two highly armed sides, equally armed sides, which is a very different story than we had 30 or 40 years ago. On almost any major policy area now, if liberals are trying to do something, there is going to be some organization on the other side. You're not simply going to have a case like you did with bilingual education where there will be nobody testifying before Congress on something, or you have a major law case and there will be nobody on the other side basically raising questions about whether it's a good idea. And so I think one way, if you want to understand politics, is to distinguish between policy areas where you have a competing elite story and a story of the kind that you're telling, which is really a consensual elite story. But the important point here is that you can almost never really come up with a good model of politics just reading off of electoral demand, just reading off of what voters want. And any model of politics that simply assumes that voters always get what they want, that what I would call a demand-side story, is really not accounting for the very changed character of American politics, which has made it much more susceptible to changes on the supply side, the supply of organizations and ideas, rather than the demand side of voter preferences and requests.
The supply side, which will lead, Obama, if he wins, to say, well, obviously the American people are pro-choice and sort of agnostic on gay marriage and so on, just because that's what the Obama campaign wants. Or on the same side, on the Republican side, McCain will say, hey, the American people just voted to cut Social Security. Well, no, they didn't.
Right.
They voted against Obama. I think this has been extremely valuable to me, Steve, and we've gone over an hour, so we probably taxed the patience of our blogging head viewer, maybe even viewers plural, who knows? But I think the point is to think about this as a study of, first of all, there was a consensual elite, because everybody who was in the elite was pretty much on the side of the Warren Court and so on, way back, or at least the memory of the Warren Court. And then a new elite created, and they've been sort of duking it out ever since for the last 30 years, and things like, I think, the Justice Department scandal, flap, brouhaha, whatever word you want, but Gonzalez and all things going on over there, it's not really clear to me that there were scandals as opposed to just deep policy differences, but that's, again, but that those two elites have been fighting it out, and I do think that the consensual elite on American foreign policy is ripe for a similar rebellion from below. Although I agree that, and for it to win, it will have to win in the way that you described. It can't win by simply saying, okay, we voted out, President so and so and Congressman and Senator so and so. We have created our own elite. I think that's one of the key points in your book is if you look at the elite and you don't like it, the chances of you being able to put their heads on a pike and parade around the streets, having blown up their office building, are pretty small. And the chances of the only way you're likely to succeed, legally succeed, is by creating an institution that looks a lot like the one you displaced, even if the ideas are different.
Right. Well, maybe you and Mike Huckabee will put something like that together.
Anyway, Steve, thank you again. Here again, I think I might have neglected to put this up in the first part of the segment, but here's the book. It's the Rise of the Conservative Legal Movement. It is extremely interesting. Don't let the fact that Princeton published it throw you off. It is not only even-handed and fair-minded, but also well-written and non-jargon-y. And so with that, Steve, thanks for lightening up on Blocking Heads.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jim.
Thank you.